I'm Dan McGrath, and this is Election Integrity Watch, a series dedicated to news and information about voting crimes and election security. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel, and if you like this video, hit the thumbs up so I know. And if you hate it, let me know in the comments what I could work on to do it better next time. Let's get into it. The topic this week is voter fraud on the rise. Voter fraud has been a problem for as long as there have been elections, but is it getting worse? There are certainly indications that it is on an upswing and perhaps even normalized as standards are continually loosened. First up, I want to talk about the battle over felon voting in Minnesota. This is still an ongoing thing. It's been in the courts. We've got a ruling, and it's going to be moving on to the appeals process, eventually to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Now, when I started research on felon voting after the 2008 election and revealed more ineligible felons voted in that monumental U.S. Senate race than the margin of victory, our government didn't go and seek out new solutions to put a stop to felon voting. No, instead, a movement began gathering steam to formally legalize it. It's been a back and forth battle ever since, but this year the legislature passed and the governor signed a new law giving supervised felons the right to vote, but notably not restoring any of their other civil rights. About 55,000 convicted felons still under Department of Corrections supervision were just added to the state's voter rolls as a result. The Minnesota Voters Alliance challenged this new law in court based on Article 7, Section 1 of the Minnesota Constitution, which states in part, "The following persons shall not be entitled or permitted to vote at any election in this state: a person not meeting the above requirements, a person who has been convicted of treason or felony unless restored to civil rights." Now, Anoka County Judge Thomas Lehman dismissed the Minnesota Voters Alliance case with prejudice, stating, "Contrary to petitioner's argument, Article 7, Section 1 does not say, quote, restored to all civil rights. Instead, it says, restored to civil rights. Basic principles," he said, "of constitutional interpretation require courts to presume that the framers of our Constitution chose language deliberately and used it precisely." Now, under his argument, if they had intended to mean it the way he's interpreted it, it might have said restored to that civil right or some civil rights. So there's some ambiguity there, but his argument doesn't really hold water because it actually works against itself, I think. Minnesota Voters Alliance Executive Director responded, was quoted by KSDP News as saying, "We believe that for a felon to regain voting rights, the Constitution requires restoration of the civil rights a felon loses upon conviction, and only a constitutional amendment can change that. We are hopeful that the appeals court will agree." Now, since then, we've learned that the MVA appeal has asked for the case to be fast-tracked to the Minnesota Supreme Court, bypassing the usual appeals court route. We'll see how that plays out, but one way or another, this case is going to wind up before the Minnesota Supreme Court. It's just a matter of how long is that going to take. Felons voting in Minnesota is just one example of normalizing election practices not long ago considered repugnant to democracy, and we're going to go on and look at some other examples. Meanwhile, a Louisiana sheriff's race seemed to be decided by just one vote in the last election. But according to the Louisiana Illuminator newspaper, that election has also been tossed out due to voter fraud that was discovered after the results were in. Some of those fraudulent votes were allegedly cast by disqualified voters, like convicted felons, but these ones were apparently incarcerated at the time. Then in Connecticut, the mayor of Bridgeport keeps getting caught up in election fraud scandals, but keeps getting reelected. Mayor Joe Ganim just won re-election, having previously won the job back under a cloud of voter fraud allegations just after emerging from a 7-year prison term for previous corruption the last time he was in office. Joe Ganim's latest win might not hold because a judge threw out the results of the primary election that put him on the ballot this year in the first place. That's because Ganim staffers had been caught on video illegally stuffing unattended ballot collection boxes with stacks of ballots. The mayor finally admitted under insurmountable evidence that his staffers broke the law, but he denies having anything to do with it, according to the Associated Press. A new primary may be forthcoming while legal battles play out, but it's clear that the people of Bridgeport have had to simply accept open corruption and subversion of the democratic process at City Hall, as this entire ugly drama has been ongoing there for decades. It's just business as usual. I'm going to take a moment to thank you all, by the way, that have been supporting Election Integrity Watch. Your tips, your donations, contributions help keep Election Integrity Watch going. There are links to all the articles that I'm talking about in this video at the electionintegritywatch.org website, as well as a link to a little tip jar. Your contribution, whether it's $1, $10, $100, all of that helps keep Election Integrity Watch going, and your contributions are greatly appreciated. We need to get the word out on these important subjects. But moving on to more ballot harvesting folly. Since the exponential increase in mail-in voting that was rushed into practice and then normalized after the worldwide COVID panic, there can be little doubt that fraud was made easier and more common. Another example of this comes from New York, where one man was just arraigned on what the New York Post described as a monster 140-count indictment. During the early voting phase of the 2023 Democrat primary in Queens, Abdul Rahman dropped off ballots in bulk as if harvested from other voters, but the major apparent problem was that none of these voters gave him permission to handle their ballots. When some of them later showed up in person to vote and were told they couldn't because they'd already submitted absentee ballots, Rahman's alleged voter fraud scheme came under scrutiny. If convicted, he faces 7 years in prison for ballot harvesting fraud. In another rather stunning piece of recent news, a polling firm decided to basically just ask voters if they cheated in the last election. An eye-popping 20% said they did. A survey conducted by the well-known pollsters Rasmussen Reports found 21% of those who cast a mail-in or absentee ballot in the 2020 election claimed to have filled out a ballot on behalf of someone other than themselves. 19% claimed someone else completed their ballot for them, and 17% claimed to have submitted a ballot in a state where they are not a permanent resident. All of these are examples of election crimes. If someone had previously asked me to guess what percentage of mail-in votes were illegally cast, I'd have guessed between 2 and 10%. To learn that 20% freely admit it when just asked about it during a survey call is stunning, even to this jaded voter fraud researcher. Based on this admittedly limited poll, the problem appears worse than most might have imagined, and growing. Without swift and decisive action to shore up the integrity of our nation's elections, we're heading into banana republic territory where no one will trust any election outcome. For a nation dependent on faith in its democratic processes, that can only spell disaster. Learn more and help spread the word by getting a copy of my new book, The Voter Fraud Manual. It's available at Amazon.com and any other bookstore, whatever your favorite bookstore is. Get a copy for yourself and get a copy for someone else, maybe a skeptical friend, your favorite talk radio host, one of your lawmakers. Give them a copy of this book. Help get the word out. This has the information that people need and solutions. Thanks for your time and attention on this important matter. You can get more information about this and other election integrity subjects at electionintegritywatch.org, and also check out my website, danmcgrath.net. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel, and if you like this video, hit the thumbs up and let me know. And if there's something that you don't like or if you hate it, let me know in the comments why, and I'll try to do better next time.